when children become 6, 7, 8 years of age, they want to understand the rules of society. And that means that they kind of push away their more outlandish, their more imaginative questions and concerns and try to figure out how to fit in and do what's required. And we find that all over the world. So it's a fact of human development. But the question implies that it would be nice if young people continued to play the creative card and if they became interested in the answers to those questions. And I think that there are a few things that we can do. One is, as in Reggio Emilia, when children are young, give them a lot of creative capital, like putting it in the bank so they can draw on it later. When people go to Reggio, especially from America, and they say, what happens to the children after they leave the preschool? The people in Reggio have a wonderful answer. They say, look at our community. It's a wonderful community. And that's because the schools created a kind of a bank on which you can draw later on. Second of all, teachers can continue to ask big questions, and that then indicates to the children it's okay to do that. We all know that children love adults who are magicians and who are wizards and who continue to be childlike. And those can serve as role models. The third and the most important thing, and it's very important for those of you who are teaching in traditional societies, is to say that school is not primarily about getting the right answer. School is about learning to think better. And sometimes you can have the right answer for the wrong reason. For example, you have a good memory, but you don't understand. Or you can have a wrong answer, or an answer that seems to be wrong, but that actually points out something that hadn't been noticed before. So the best teachers take everything that young people say and do seriously and try to help them find meaning in that. And in that way, the children will both continue to ask good questions, but more importantly, when they come up with an answer which isn't the society answer, either they will say, well, what did I do wrong? How could I have done it better? Or they'll say, I was thinking about these things in a different way. I'll give you an example. How many objects are in front of me? Maybe the teacher says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But maybe the child says 1 or 2, because from the child's point of view, there is the inanimate object and the animate object. Or maybe the child is seeing all of this against the wider, it's the figure against the background. So rather than saying wrong, next question, which so many traditional societies say, instead you say, well, help me. Sibyl said there were 6, and Fatma said there were 3. Let's hear why Fatma thought there were 3. Let's hear why Eric thought there were 2. Let's hear why Mickey thought there were 10. And that's how you develop a mind that is creative and critical, rather than one that thinks the job is to just tell the teacher what the teacher told them. Yeah. Do you want to read another question?
Okay. İnsanların fiziksel farklılıklarıyla birlikte kişisel özelliklerinin de birbirinden farklı olmasının sizce temel kaynağı ne olabilir? Teşekkür ederim.
I have a machine which just makes funny noises. Can I trade with someone? Yeah.
İnsanların fiziksel farklılıklarıyla birlikte kişisel özelliklerin de birbirinden farklı olmasının sizce temel kaynağı ne olabilir?
Yeah, why do people have different profiles of intelligence? I still think you're asking the same question, namely, where do differences between people come from? Yeah? Okay. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Obviously, physical differences come primarily from genetics. However, we also know that nutrition plays an important role. People now are much taller than they were 100 years ago. Women begin to menstruate much earlier than they did 100 years ago. This has nothing to do with genetics. It has to do with nutrition and health. With intelligences, clearly some of the differences are genetic. I'm sure that Einstein had a better genetic heritage for doing logical, mathematical, and spatial work than I do and than most of you do. And I'm sure Mozart had a better musical genetics because his father was a musician and his sister was a musician and so on. But Mozart would never have become a musician if he lived in a society where music was not important, or he didn't have a father who could teach him. And he would not have become a great composer if he didn't live in Europe at a time when there were prodigies who were marched from one capital to the other, from Prague to Vienna to Salzburg, and given opportunities. So who your parents are is not just a genetic question, but what skills your parents have, and do you live in a culture which values your skills, and you live at a time when there are resources to help you develop those abilities. There's a very famous Indian mathematician named Ramanujan who lived in India 100 years ago, and he read European textbooks, and he made fantastic discoveries in mathematics. But unfortunately, all the discoveries he made had already been made. He just didn't know about it. And so he was eventually brought to England, and his teacher there said that Ramanujan was the greatest natural mathematician that he had ever met. But because Western society had developed mathematics so much more than Indian society, by the time he died, he never made any new discoveries. So this is a fascinating finding from Malcolm Gladwell's new book, Outlier. All the founders of the computer revolution were born in America in 1954 or 1955. That seems crazy. Why would Bill Gates, Bill Joy, Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs all be born in the United States in 1954 or 1955? Was there sunspots? If this was a class, I would have you discuss with one another. The reason is that about 15 years later, computing had advanced to the point that boys who wanted to spend 24 hours a day working on a computer, like those chess kids, could invent amazing things. If they were born in 1944, they were born too early. If they were born in 1964, these discoveries of software had already been made. So not only do you have to pick your parents right, You have to be born in the right place at the right time with the right resources, and importantly, go to a school where you're allowed to play on the computer 24 hours a day. I teach at Harvard University. When you ask Harvard students whom they admire the most, they have a lot of difficulty answering the question. But when you push them, they mention Bill Gates, whom everybody knows, and they mention Mark Zuckerberg. Mark Zuckerberg invented Facebook, which was the first college-oriented social network. Both Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg dropped out of Harvard. They didn't finish because they realized that they were onto something, and instead of taking my course, they were much better off going out into the world and finishing the job. Last year we gave Bill Gates an honorary degree, which made his father very happy, and I'm sure we'll give Mark Zuckerberg an honorary degree too. So one other thing which might interest you, given the question, all over the world, IQ has been going up. In fact, it's been going up 15 points in 50 years. It's called the Flynn effect. This is a huge number. This is a standard deviation. It basically means that the white-black difference in IQ in America 50 years ago is completely erased if you simply test blacks, because blacks in 2000 are doing as well as whites did in 1950. Thank you. But of course, whites' IQ have been going up as well, because everybody's IQ has been going up 15 points in 50 years. Why is that? It's not because our genes have changed. Genes change over thousands of years. There are two competing explanations. One explanation is better nutrition. My explanation is the increasing availability of school and school-type experiences. Because remember, IQ tests were developed to predict who would do well in a certain kind of school. In Paris in 1900, not everybody went to school, and most people never went beyond grammar school. In the United States, only 2% of Americans graduated from secondary school in 1900. Now 60% go on beyond secondary education. So I think school ways of thinking have become more familiar, and that's what raises IQ. Why do I perseverate on this point? Because individual differences are also going to be affected by huge changes in the culture. I know there are people from Iran here, and I'm so happy that there are people from Iran here because what's happening in Iran is very important for the whole world, just as what's happening in Turkey is very important. But without making any kind of political statement, I will simply say that the kind of societies which emerge in Turkey and Iran, and they're very different kinds of societies, Jordan is here as well, over the next 50 years will determine which intelligences are encouraged and how they're used. And the same thing is true about America, or Belgium, or Chile, or Afghanistan. Intelligences are not just contained between the ears. They are in the opportunities available in culture, the role models of adults, especially adults for whom attention is being paid, the reward system, and the reward system is often what is put on the media. Is it movie stars? Is it athletes? I think it's very important when you go to East Asia, there are always the pictures of Einstein. That's just not the same as a picture of Madonna, if you know who Madonna is. And I don't mean the religious Madonna, I mean the singer, dancer. Why don't we take one more question? Okay. That's a very good question, and one that is a good one to end on, because you've been very patient and we all need a rest. First of all, when MI theory was developed over 25 years ago, I believed that we had parts of the brain which processed each of the separate intelligences. We now know a lot more about the brain, and that picture was quite simple, if not simplistic. First of all, there are more differences among people in brains than I would have thought. Second of all, brains are much more finely tuned. We don't just have areas for spatial intelligence. We have specific areas which recognize just faces. So each of the intelligences has sub-intelligences. Third of all, and very important, the brain is much more flexible or plastic, that's the technical term, than anybody had thought. You can remove half a brain of a young child, and that young child will develop surprisingly normally if he's treated well. And nobody expected that. So a first answer to the question is our understanding of the brain is changing rapidly, and an updated version of MI theory would have to take that into account. I have a special intelligence of knocking things off of podia. The theory of multiple intelligences claims that there's no necessary connection between any two intelligences. So if I know that Sibel is musical, which she is, I cannot predict how intrapersonal she is, or vice versa. So there's no necessary link between any two intelligences. And some supposed links, like music and mathematics, do not stand up to close study. Nonetheless, in almost everybody, intelligences work together all the time and very smoothly. So we had the musicians up here. They're using their bodily intelligence, their personal intelligence, their musical intelligence, their personal intelligence very fluently, and interestingly, without the need for a conductor. And there is one very famous musical group called Orpheus, which performs without a conductor. The big debate within psychology is, do we need what we would call in English a central intelligence agency in the mind-brain, a CIA, which coordinates all the different intelligences? For my purposes, I don't believe we need to have that. I think intelligences work together because activities in our society call on the intelligences to work together. If you're going to be a dancer, you need to be able to combine musical and spatial and bodily intelligence. Nobody has to tell you to do that. It just happens because you're a dancer. But the existence of brain-damaged adults and of young people with learning disabilities, and of autistic individuals and prodigies and savants tells us that for some people, they're not able to get the intelligences to work together. And that's a challenge. And so, if you are a teacher, you might say, I need to have intelligences 1 and 2 work together. But if that doesn't work, I might say maybe I should use intelligences 1 and 3 together instead, or 3 and 4. And so, the short answer to the question that was raised is often intelligences work together very well, and you don't need anybody to tell you to do it. Sometimes if they're not working together particularly well, we can help them work together better through practice. But sometimes, especially if you have some kind of disease, they're not going to work together, and then you need to find another route using different intelligences. Some of you are scientists, and many of you know about science, and I'm going to end with a little parable. Scientists have to be good in logical, mathematical, and also in spatial intelligence. You're probably not going to be a good scientist a la Einstein or Darwin if you don't have logical, mathematical, and spatial intelligence. But scientists have to publish. And to publish, you have to be good in language. So as a scientist, either you have to get good in language yourself, that is, combine your linguistic intelligence with the other ones, or find somebody else who's a good writer, and then you collaborate, and he or she does the writing, and you do the science. Then when you hit the age of 40, you can't do science anymore, so your language and logic aren't very helpful. So you go and run a laboratory. And to run a laboratory, you have to have interpersonal intelligence. So either you develop it yourself, or you find a lab manager who has good interpersonal intelligence, or you sell real estate instead. So the point here is that over life, the intelligences you need change, and either you have to acquire new ones or work with somebody who has the other one, or you'll find you can no longer function productively in the new environment. So thank you very much for your attention. Have a good lunch, and we'll see you in the afternoon. Well, good afternoon. I hope you had a good break, chance to connect to people whom you wanted to connect to. Part of the challenge in a 2-day session like this is to make human connections, but also intellectual and disciplinary connections. There was no orchestration for Gary to speak when he did, but clearly this is an example of how you can approach mathematical concepts using a number of different intelligences, stimulating different parts of the human mind. And so I hope that you can continue to make connections of this sort. One housekeeping item: a number of you wanted me to sign books or to take photographs, and rather than doing it here and there, I'm going to go to the dinner venue this evening at 7 p.m. rather than 7:30, and if people want to ask me something or get a photo or a signature, that would be the time to do it. So this afternoon we're discussing creativity. 2 words of background. First, once I began to talk and write about intelligences, people said to me, well, what about creativity? And even though I had an interest in creativity, that hadn't been connected particularly to my work on intelligences. And you probably all have the experience, if you present a new idea, yours or somebody else's, people often say, well, what do you think about so-and-so? One of the translators said to me, oh, you're studying creativity, what about leadership? And that's exactly what I was asked 20 years ago, so I began to develop ideas about intelligence and leadership. That's for another occasion. The second preparatory statement is that nowadays everybody who's interested in education also raises the question of creativity or innovation. And the reason is fairly straightforward. Almost everything that can be done easily or automatically will be done by machines. And so what is increasingly valuable in our society are people who can do things which are more original, creative, innovative, where the machines haven't quite caught up yet. And that's the second reason. But first, I promised you that we would take a few questions that had been submitted in writing this morning and visit them before I actually begin the presentation. So Sibel has the questions. She selected them, not me.
Professor, not writing them over. The first question is, what is your opinion about Gilbert's models of intelligence?
One of the first people to study intelligence in a pluralistic way was a psychologist named Guilford. And in fact, he was probably the first psychologist to try to study creativity. And I'm going to mention in a few moments how he studied creativity. What Guilford did was to outline a number of different materials which people could work with, like words and drawings, different kinds of symbols, and the different kinds of operations, mental operations, one could perform on those symbols or materials. And he then simply multiplied the number of materials by the number of operations. And originally he decided there were 120 different intellectual functions. And then he had some inflation, and he ended up saying 150 different operations. So if Guilford or his students were here, they would say, well, you have only 7 or 8, we have 150. So they're way ahead of me. You remember this morning I said that there are other people who spoke about pluralistic intelligences, more than one intelligence. The first one was a psychologist named Thurston, who in the 1930s proposed 7 different kinds of intellectual operations, same number as I did. And then nowadays, very famous American psychologist Robert Sternberg has proposed a triarchic or 3-part aspect of intelligence. So many of us believe there's more than one intelligence. But the difference is what I said this morning. My theory is not based upon tests. It's based upon input from different scholarly disciplines, biology, genetics, anthropology, and so on. And I have a specific set of criteria. For example, brain localization, core operations, populations which either have or lack a certain intelligence. So I approach it very differently from Guilford or Sternberg or Thurston. This doesn't mean that I'm right and they're wrong, though in fact I am right and they are wrong. But it does mean that we approach these things very differently. Next question.
Next question is, what is the difference between ability and intelligence?
This is a definitional question. Each of my intelligences contains within it various abilities. I mentioned, for example, that spatial intelligence involves the capacity to maneuver in wide space, such as people do when they sail or fly a plane, and capacity to deal in local space is if you're building something or playing chess. The capacity to manipulate an image in your head. What would this look like upside down? We could call those sub-intelligences or abilities. And the existence of an intelligence invites the human being and human cultures to value certain abilities which use that intelligence. So I talked about the naturalist intelligence as the ability, notice, the ability to distinguish one plant from another or one animal from another. That's not so important anymore, but in our world of consumer and commerce, we use that intelligence to discriminate between one automobile and another, or one pair of sneakers and another. And so these are new abilities using the same brain neurons. But I try to define how I use terms, but if you wanted to call the intelligences abilities, I wouldn't object. To me, nothing hangs on the particular term, and especially when we're dealing with translation, we can't have the same term anyway. I did remark jokingly last night to Eric DeCorta that I wouldn't be here if I'd written a book called 7 Abilities, because nobody would find that controversial. By calling them intelligences, I essentially joined a debate with Guilford, Thurston, Binet, Sternberg, and so on. And so I'm glad I did, because otherwise I wouldn't be here in Turkey.
Okay, this question and the last question, we could go to our session. You said that earlier that you don't believe in the IQ testing. And what would be the criteria to select mentally retarded students or kids for a special education?
That's a very complicated question, and I don't feel I have a special expertise. I think that probably the intelligence test, the IQ test, is a reasonable test for determining whether children are educable or not. If you have an IQ of 50 or 60, probably it's going to be very difficult to educate you, at least in the way that we now educate people. On the other hand, I'm not an expert in this area, and last year, somebody with Down's syndrome, which is the most common form of retardation, actually passed the Massachusetts graduating test from secondary school, and it's a very difficult test, more difficult than most states. And that shows you the risk. If that child, when she was 5 or 6, had taken an IQ test and done very poorly, she might never have had an education at all. What I would call for is observation of the child in a number of different environments, and the use of several different kinds of measures. I think it's always a mistake to depend on one single measure. Having said that, the IQ test, the WISC or the WACE, in the hand of a good clinician can reveal a lot of information. 2 ways. One, there are subscales, and you might do better in a performance subscale than in a verbal one, or in a memory subscale rather than a praxis subscale. And very, very importantly, the good clinician doesn't just look at the score, he or she looks at how you approach the test and the kind of errors that are made. So, for example, on the block design, some people who have right hemisphere problems will get details right, but will miss the overall contour. Other people with left hemisphere problems will get the overall contour or shape correct, but will miss the details. So if you have a very good eye, as a clinician, you can get a lot of information from an IQ test. So please don't say that Howard Gardner said to throw away the IQ test. What I'm saying here is there are many kinds of intelligence. The IQ test looks at certain ones in certain ways. So I don't object to the IQ test. I object to using it as the single measure of intellect, and particularly just your what's called your full-scale score. So, speaking of tests, in psychology, the standard way of studying creativity, and we owe this to Guilford, who was a major psychologist, is to show people an object like this and to say, how many different things could it be? And you get a high creativity score if you can think of lots of different things. So it's not just a earphone, it's also a back scratcher, or a boomerang. So if you can think of lots of different things, and some of them are unusual, then you get a high score and you're called creative. Or you're shown an abstract geometric pattern, let's say one that looks like this, and you're asked how many different things it could be. And if you can mention lots of different things, and some of them are unusual but not crazy, then again you're called creative. I thought that was a pretty limited way of studying creativity as I understand it. And also, consistent with MI theory, it assumed that if you were creative in one thing, you'd be creative in everything. And of course, MI theory says the opposite. MI theory says you might be very creative with language, but not at all creative with spatial or bodily abilities, skills, intelligences. So, you're already discovering a pattern here. I take a look at the usual way of studying things and say, I'm not so sure that that's the best way. So, what I decided to do instead was to study people who were highly creative, people who everybody would agree were very innovative, very novel, really changed the way other people think. For me, what I call big C creativity are people or groups that really change our life. So Bill Gates is very creative because he's changed what many of us have done. The Beatles, very creative as composers and performers. You can add whoever you want to your list of highly creative people. So I decided to study 20th century creators, people who lived about a century ago and who changed various domains. And what I did in particular was to study people whom I thought were using different intelligences. So I decided to study creators who I thought were using different intelligences. So I wrote a couple of books on this topic, and I'm going to show you the creators, but I'm going to show them to you when they were young and did their most creative work. This is the first one, and you can try to guess who it is. He's much more famous this way. That's Einstein, and he, I argued, was creative in the logical mathematical area. But later I'll say that I was wrong, that many of these people were creative with more than one intelligence. But Einstein was my a priori example of logical mathematical intelligence. This is the second person in Montmartre, about 1900, and he eventually became very famous as Pablo Picasso. And just as Einstein changed our ideas about time and space, Picasso had enormous influence on painting, drawing, sculpture. He changed those domains. People painted differently after Picasso. This is the third person, again, as a young man, the composer Igor Stravinsky. But just as Picasso did his most innovative paintings when he was young, Stravinsky wrote his most innovative music, Le Sacre de Printemps, the Rite of Spring, when he looked more like this than like this. So Stravinsky was, of course, an example of musical intelligence. This is an Anglo-American poet. This was his graduation picture from college in 1910. But he's more famous this way as T.S. Eliot. He wrote a very important poem called The Waste Land, and many other poems and plays. And again, Eliot's work had enormous influence in literature. This is a famous American dancer, probably the inventor of modern dance in America, Martha Graham. And I should apologize. These examples are largely Western examples. If I were more literate, I would have been able to give examples from this part of the world. I apologize for that. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence, of course, the dance. Since I'm a psychologist, I needed to have one psychologist. This is Sigmund Freud as a young man, and this is the more famous picture of Freud as an old man. Probably even older than Gary and me. This is a very famous man, not from my part of the world. Freud was intrapersonal intelligence, and this is Gandhi, interpersonal intelligence. So I decided to study these people as much as I could to learn about creativity, and you can already anticipate that the creativity of a dancer is very different than the creativity of a political leader or a painter or a scientist, because they're using different intelligences. A couple more. This is a childhood picture of Virginia Woolf, who was a very innovative British author of the 20th century. And then, even though he isn't from the 20th century, this is Mozart, who was already known as a prodigy. Somebody, even when he was very young, was performing all over Europe. Mozart had a special love for Turkey and Turks and composed music a la turca. And this is a painting of Mozart when he was in his 30s. You know, he died when he was very young. So what I'm going to do now is tell you about some of the things I discovered about highly creative people. And what I'm hoping we can all do together is to say, what could we learn about more ordinary people, like us, or like our students, our family? What lessons could we learn from people who are highly creative, who really change the way we think and feel and understand? One more highly creative person, Darwin. Darwin appears in all my lectures. He's the Alfred Hitchcock of my lectures. He always makes an appearance. And some of this work was carried out, again, with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and David Feldman, so I want to give them credit, two of my colleagues. I want to say one more word about creativity, because at least in English, it's used in 3 different ways, and I want to try to keep that in mind for the talk. So far, I've been talking about what I call big C creativity, very big C, people who really change things. Freud, Picasso, Gandhi, Ataturk, very big C creativity. Then there's the more ordinary kinds of creativity. Somebody decides to give a dinner party and serves the dessert first. That's creative, but it's not going to change the way other people do things. There's a social event and somebody makes a poem. It's not going to change how other people write poetry, but it's creative. It's little c creative. And then many people misuse the word creative. They use it in a way which I think is not valid. They say the arts are creative and only the arts. And I think that's just wrong. I think you can be little c creative or big C creative in the arts, but also in science, in business, in politics, in sports. Creative people are people who change the way other people do things. And most people in business are not creative. Most people in athletics are not creative. Most people in science are not creative. And most people in the arts are not creative. They may want to be, but they don't really change what anybody else does. So the third form of creativity, I think, is not valid. I argue every area has people that are big C creative, little c creative, or not creative at all. And the word I use for people who are not creative is expert. And there's nothing wrong with being an expert. The world depends upon experts. If I need surgery, I don't want somebody who's big C creative. I just want an expert. And when I go flying off to my next stop on Monday, I want someone who can get us out of a jam, but I don't want any experimenting on my airplane, please, on the airplane that I'm flying. So remember, I gave a definition of intelligence this morning, and I'm now going to give a definition of creative, and the definition deliberately is similar to my definition of intelligence, but not exactly the same. I'm going to do it in terms of individuals, but I could do it in terms of creativity, period. Creative individuals like Picasso, Gandhi, Darwin, regularly solve problems, make products, and raise questions. The important word here is regularly. People are not creative once in their lives. It is a regular way of being. And they regularly raise these questions or solve these problems or make things which are initially, and they do it in a domain. Remember the word domain from this morning? People are not creative in general. Nobody is interested in Freud's poetry or Freud's music. Freud hated music, in fact. He made his parents get rid of the piano that his sister played, which shows you what Vienna was like in the 1860s and who had the power. Freud was creative in writing and in science. So people are creative or not creative in a domain. They're not creative in general, except, of course, for Leonardo da Vinci, who was creative in every sphere. But he was quite unusual. There are not a lot of Leonardos around. So creative individuals regularly do things in a domain in a way that is initially novel, unusual, captures attention, but eventually it affects other people and affects the way we think. I mean, I could give the rest of my talk like this. That would be novel, but I would just look foolish. Nobody would change the way they do things. So that's not creative. That's just novel. But if, for some reason, people began to give talks jumping on one leg, we would call it creative because it affected what other people did. But don't worry, that won't happen. The phrase that we use in English for creative people is that creative people think outside the box. Most of us think inside a box, but if this is the box, creative people think outside the box. But tomorrow, in my last lecture, I will argue that you can't think outside the box unless you have a box. And the box is the attainment of expertise, which takes about 10 years. Though I said this morning, maybe in chess, we've reduced the number of years it takes to be an expert. So I hope you see that my definition of creativity is similar than intelligence, but intelligence just makes you an expert. If you develop an intelligence, you'll be an expert in woodworking, or in flying a plane, or in gardening, or in accounting. But if you're creative, you will raise new questions, you'll do it regularly, and if you're lucky, it will affect how other people think and behave sooner or later. Otherwise, even if you think you're creative, and your mother thinks you're creative, if the world doesn't agree, you don't get any prize. That's the sad news. One other finding, and this one I think has a lot of importance for those of us in education, there are at least 5 different ways in which people can be creative. And this was not understood by the psychologists like Guilford, who initially developed creativity tests. One thing is you can solve a particular problem. If you figure out how a physical process works, when Watson and Crick figured out the double helix, they were solving a particular problem. What is the structure of genetic material? You can develop a general conceptual scheme. Freud developed a theory of the unconscious, of sexuality, of layers of meaning, of dream interpretation. It wasn't solving a problem so much, it was a general way of thinking about things. Same with Piaget. Piaget didn't solve a particular problem. He developed a way of thinking about how cognition develops. You can create a permanent work. What are museums? Museums are institutions which contain objects which curators have judged to be creative, worth looking at. So paintings, symphonies, choreography, and so on. A fourth kind of creativity is being able to perform in a relatively stylized way. By stylized, I mean the rules for what you do are pretty much set, but still, in the way you do it, you can show your creativity. This morning we heard a string ensemble. They were playing music which is supposed to be played in a certain way, but they don't play it exactly the same way each time, and their creativity is in how they performed it this morning. I have given a talk like this before, but I changed the talk to some extent for this audience on this day, so I can show a little creativity in how I make this presentation. The fifth kind is a high-stake performance. That means something public where there's a huge amount that could go right or wrong. If I were trying to become a professor at this university, with the president sitting here, and he made the sole judgment whether I should be a professor based on how I spoke today, that would be high performance. And I'd be very nervous. But I could be creative to convince him to make me a professor. A presidential debate, when Barack Obama was debating against Hillary Clinton or against John McCain, those are high-stake performances. And the reason that we should think about this is students in our classes could be creative in any one of these ways. And we shouldn't assume that just because they're not creative, say, in giving a talk, they might well be creative in asking a new question or approaching a question in a new way. So, I promised to tell you what we discovered in studying these highly creative people. First of all, as young people, they came from bourgeois households where there was a family present. The family was supportive, but the young person was expected to work usually on school, and in my terms, the young person was expected to be disciplined. And if the child didn't work hard on school, the parents would get angry at them. Whether or not you came from a household like that, any one of you who've read 19th century European novels would know what a bourgeois household was like. These creative people, as soon as they had a chance, would move to a big city. With all due respect, if they were in Bordeaux, they would probably move to Istanbul, and maybe they would move from Istanbul to Vienna or to New York. They have a sense that they want to perform on a wide stage. And, interestingly, they find other young people who also came from smaller places but moved to a center of activity, scientific, artistic, etc. This could be entirely different today. Why? Because today the internet allows people all over the world to connect while they're still sitting in Bordeaux or Scranton, Pennsylvania, where I was born. But in the olden days, you couldn't do that. You had to go to where the other young people were, and those were the big cities. Like everybody else, these young people had to become an expert. You cannot do creative work in writing, dance, science, painting, politics, unless you've spent about 10 years becoming an expert. But where does the creative person differ from the expert? And this is true for young children as well as it is for Picasso. When something unexpected happens, something that doesn't fit in, something that's strange, most of us would ignore it or push it away because it complicates matters. But for whatever reason, the creative person becomes interested in what's unusual, unexpected. They get attracted. They get absorbed. They even become obsessive about this irregularity, this anomaly. Freud began to work with hysterics and developed a fascination with what made women act in hysteric fashion, claiming that they had a pain when there was no physical reason for the pain. Picasso became fascinated with whether you could draw all parts of an object so you could see them at the same time. Stravinsky wanted to compose music which wasn't completely harmonic, but very strongly rhythmic, often based upon Russian, Slavic, folk music, and so on. As these creative people move from the box, outside of the box, they become more isolated, lonely, afraid. In the extreme case, they think they're going crazy because nobody else is seeing or hearing or writing or symbolizing or imagining what they are. Think of Einstein. When he was 16, he asked himself the question, what would it be like to travel on a beam of light? And then he asked himself, what would it be like to determine whether time is exactly the same in two parts of the universe. And then he asked what happens when objects are falling in containers which are also falling. And these questions were not questions everybody was asking. And the answers that he was coming up with were not answers that anybody else had come up with before. And therefore, 6 of the 7 people I studied actually had some kind of a breakdown when they were having their most creative breakthroughs. And this is something I'll talk about a lot tomorrow, there's always a tension, a conflict between the discipline, the expertise on the one hand. Picasso doesn't stop knowing how to paint. Stravinsky doesn't stop knowing how to compose. Einstein doesn't forget his mathematics and physics. But these people are being pulled in ways which the discipline was not equipped to handle. Now, none of us is going to have an Einstein or Picasso in our class. But many of us will have students who see things in a somewhat different way. Do we slap them? Do we make fun of them? Do we punish them? Do we give them an F, which is a failing grade? Or do we try to understand why they are thinking about this and maybe help them and support them? This is one of the lessons about more ordinary life that we can see magnified when we study these gigantic figures. Here's a moment of lightness. It turns out that for all creative innovations, whether they are scientific, like Darwin's theory of evolution, or religious, like Martin Luther's rejection of Catholicism and being the first Protestant, or ideological, Marxist, Leninist communism. Who do you think is attracted to those ideas first? Firstborns or laterborns? The oldest child in the family or ones that are younger? I heard somebody yell out an answer. Think about it for a minute. Probably most creators are firstborn, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But people who are attracted to creative ideas first are always laterborns. And the reason probably is that they want to knock the firstborn away. They want to get rid of the expert in the discipline and embrace something new. In fact, in this book, Born to Rebel, Frank Sulloway reports it took 100 years, a full century, for firstborns to be as sympathetic to evolutionary theory a la Darwin as it took laterborns. So to make this concrete, in 1870, there were already as many laterborns who embraced evolutionary theory as there was in 1970 firstborns. So you can think about yourself, your family, and see whether the theory fits you.